Right. Okay. So here we go, part two, people. So what we've got at this stage within the poem is essentially the journey back to the castle. Christabel has found Geraldine out in the woods. They journey back towards the castle. She was a furlong from the castle gate, so they're travelling kind of a furlong back towards this kind of supposed place of protection. Okay. Now, again, there's various bits that you could potentially comment on here. I'm being kind of reductive with it. The first bit I'll point out is that Sir Leoline is described as kind of a weak of health. There are these hints starting to come in that Sir Leoline is not the strong figure of protection that he initially appears to be. And as they move towards this kind of place of protection, they kind of cross over these kind of supposed barriers, these supposed protections that will keep kind of threat out. So you get the moat, which again, you think about old castles, it's the kind of bit you fill with water or with kind of sharpened stakes around the walls. You get the gate that was ironed within and without. So this kind of strong gate where only recently kind of an army in battle array has kind of marched out. And this is where we start to get the potential inferences that there's something kind of strange and supernatural around Geraldine. So in folklore, you get kind of iron is antithetical to kind of fairies. So this would be a kind of supposed thing that would kind of keep them out, but she kind of passes across it. But she passes across it through deception. And again, you think about the kind of folklore surrounding kind of vampires and various supernatural figures where you need to invite them in. They need to be summoned, essentially. And it's often done through kind of trickery. So you get the narrative voice here. The lady sank belike through pain. So the lady sank down. The lady lies down. She kind of faints, swoons, as if she's in pain. Christabel lifts her up. She lifts her over the threshold into the castle. So this becomes Christabel's kind of invitation, her kind of taking her across. And then suddenly Geraldine moves as if she's not in pain. So the implication becomes that this is a kind of a deceptive act, that she's now been kind of given access and is able to kind of, take advantage of that. You get this kind of, again, hinted at in other ways as it kind of goes through. Christabel and Geraldine are placed in kind of opposition, one with the other. Christabel, the beautiful Christian, Geraldine, she who kind of holds the spear. And if you think about, there's a lot of imagery with Christabel kind of praising God, sort of shouting to God, devoutly cried to the lady by her side, praise we the Virgin or Divine. And yet Geraldine doesn't pray. We never actually see Geraldine pray directly. Later on it does kind of, sort of, I've got to go and pray, but we don't actually see her pray. And again, you're thinking about kind of folklore and folk beliefs, the idea that sort of evil beings cannot actually kind of pray. They can't do this in a kind of legitimate way. We've got the recurrence of the Mastiff bitch as well, which appears kind of, its angry moan as Geraldine goes past. So there's some kind of ominous premonition type aspect here. But again, we know that the Mastiff bitch is powerless, essentially. We also, again, they're just walking through the castle at this stage. They pass the Baron's room as they kind of return to Christabel's bedchambers. And on the journey through the castle itself, we see the boss of Sir Leoline's shields on the wall. You can see it there in the background, but it's there, it's hidden away. The implication is that this once strong image of protection has been kind of lost. It's been sort of taken away. And there are other bits that we didn't kind of point out directly to go through, but sort of as they pass the Baron's room, there's something kind of ominous around it, as still as death with stifled breath. So there's this kind of fear associated with the Baron. It's sort of his room is not necessarily associated with a genuine place of protection. I'm not going to point out anything super specific from this bit. Again, it's just they return to the chamber. They sort of make themselves at home. Geraldine is offered by Christabel this kind of cordial wine, so a wine mixed with water, essentially a kind of fruit wine that supposedly her mother made before she passed. So this is, a nice gift to Geraldine, sort of this made of wildflower, this wine. This bit that follows kind of develops on that, the image of Christabel's mother reintroduced. And Christabel's mother died during childbirth is the implication. She died that hour I was born. Again, we get a kind of absence of mother figures in A Doll's House in many different ways. Nora kind of distances herself from the children. Anne-Marie is kind of weirdly, she'd become a mother to other people's children whilst discarding her own child. You've got Nora's own mother. We don't know what happened to her when she died. We've got Krogstad, whose wife has died, leaving him to look after the children. So it's a kind of an image that cuts across both of them. And supposedly, so a kind of prophecy, or a kind of, the prophecy would probably be the best word to go about it, associated with Christabel's mother. And on her deathbed, she did say that she would hear the castle bell strike 12 upon my wedding day. So the castle bell striking 12, the wedding day is associated with kind of this transition from girlhood to womanhood in many ways, with kind of those associations with kind of lost virginity and things alongside. So it does seem like on a surface level she's going to be there, she's going to be this kind of guardian spirit until the point that Christabel doesn't need her anymore, until she kind of passes herself into this new state of womanhood. Now, this image is kind of subverted in the text. Geraldine kind of disrupts it, and Geraldine is the one who, again, through this kind of supernatural power becomes the implication, she takes away this protection of the mother figure. So you get kind of off wandering mother, peak and pine, I have power to bid thee flee. The implication that Geraldine can see the spirits of the dead. Can she, the bodiless dead, espy? The narrative voice can't see the Christabel's mother, but the implication is that Geraldine can. And Geraldine is commanding here. She has the power to bid thee flee. She's imperative in her language. Off, woman, off. This kind of casting off of Christabel's mother. So I would, again, you're looking for kind of similarities and differences here. And again, they're not the only ones you could pick out. There are other bits you could use. These are just kind of suggested kind of elements that you might kind of do just to kind of get you along the right tracks. So I might take the bit where she kind of sinks down to cross over the threshold, to cross over the gate. And I would have it against Nora early on, where she's eating the macaroons and Torvald kind of challenges her on the eating of the macaroons. So have a quick look, think what you might kind of draw out from this bit, and see what kind of points of comparison you might make. Okay, so if you want to pause and think about it yourself, to find the two bits, do it now. back by the magic of technology. Right, so both of them are committing deceptive acts. So the thing that kind of binds them together is an act of deception. Having said that, obviously Nora's act of deception is seemingly kind of more benign. It's almost more comic in implications. We know it's an act of deception because we have seen her at the start of the play eating the macaroons. So we know that she's being deceptive here. We know that is what's happening. And with Nora, it again, it's all about kind of transgressive acts across them. Nora's act is a kind of transgressive act against her husband, whereas with Geraldine, it's something more kind of supernatural, something potentially kind of more sinister creeping in here, associated with this kind of older folklore alongside. So both of them are kind of seeking that kind of decision making. You can make another point of kind of comparison here. Nora's defiance of kind of her husband's authority, again, in the context of the time period, this is a kind of a deviant act. In a more symbolic way, Christabel is the one who invites this kind of, what we might describe as like a sexual threat of Geraldine across the threshold. So in a wider sense, beyond the kind of more literal eating of macaroons, taking a person across a gateway, there's a kind of symbolic aspect that we might associate with it as well. So that would be one. I would also pick out this bit. So the second bit is Torvald speaking, "My darling wife, I don't feel as if I could hold you tight enough. Do you know, Nora, that I've often wished that you might be threatened by some great danger, so I might risk my life's blood and everything for your sake." And then you've got Sir Leoline and the bit about the shield boss. So again, if you want to, just pause, have a quick think, try and think yourself, use that kind of active thinking rather than just passively listening. See if you can work out what essentially the point of comparison is before I kind of tell you, okay? So, what I would be saying with this bit is basically there's a supposed protection in both cases. So Leoline is this kind of supposed figure of strength. Torvald says he will kind of risk his life's blood, everything for your sake. So he will do whatever is necessary. With this one, you need to kind of take it with the context of what we know happens afterwards. It's a kind of empty protection. We know that as soon as Torvald is tested on this, he essentially fails in this protection. So he desires this kind of chance to prove himself, but he fails in it. The same as Sir Leoline's protection is kind of offered. It's this supposed strong place of protection, but you get these kind of hints around the weakness of it. Again, this murky old niche in the wall where it's all out of the way. It's in darkness. It's not a place of kind of safety that's genuinely being offered. This is a weak place of safety. So again, you can deal with it both ways. You can sort of look at the promise of protection, this promise of masculine protection. You can look at the failure of protection. You can look at kind of, anticlimaxes. If they were to ask you a question on anticlimax, this kind of, again, supposed something good and then it drops down. There's lots of different ways that something like this could kind of manifest. I would also take this bit, so just kind of off this hour is mine, where Geraldine is kind of challenging the mother spirit. And again, this one is going to rely on similarity and difference. Towards the end of A Doll's House with Nora, kind of sit down, it will take some time, I have a lot to talk over with you. And then you get kind of Helmer who sits and goes, no, it's just it, you don't understand me. So have a look at those bits, pause it, just see what you kind of make of them yourself. And then unpause me and see if we agree on whatever it is, okay? Okay, so in both cases, we've got a strong, empowered female figure. Geraldine has power. She's commanding, off. Nora has power. Towards the end of the play, Nora gains power. Sit down. Listen to what I have to say. And you must do it. There's a kind of certainty in Nora. And you're thinking about difference as well. So with Geraldine, again, it's a kind of an anxiety-inducing power. There's something supernatural. It's a casting off of Christabel's kind of protective spirit. Whereas for Nora, we see her kind of casting off the entrapment of Torvald, kind of casting off the restrictive strictures of marriage and essentially becoming, her own entity, taking agency back. So this is about taking agency back. This is Geraldine having agency, but it's also about kind of taking those protections away from Christabel, actually reducing Christabel's agency. Whereas Torvald is disempowered in this one. So sort of Torvald is confused. You alarm me, Nora, and I don't understand you. He didn't know what's happening here. And then we move towards the end of the poem. Okay. So, all who live in the upper sky do love you, holy Christabel. So Christabel here, we're in the bedchamber. They're preparing to sleep is kind of the implication. Geraldine is basically saying, you are a holy person, Christabel. God loves you. The angels love you. You're kind of archetypally good. And it's all about kind of this corruptive aspect to Geraldine. So we need to Coleridge needs to stress the purity of Christabel. And then it can be kind of symbolically disrupted. So Geraldine again is in this kind of position of power. Now enrobe yourself, for I must pray ere yet lie in bed. So before I can lie in bed, I must pray. Again, we take this with a pinch of salt. Whether she actually prays or not is a dubious point. It's kind of deceptive act. But this kind of symbolic disrobing of Christabel, this kind of, again, this vulnerability, it creates this kind of sexualization associated with it. And Christabel obeys. We see this kind of power dynamic. Geraldine has power over Christabel. But again, what's interesting here, because both of them are going to be depicted undressing. With Christabel's undressing, you get the image, her gentle limbs, she did undress. There's something kind of benign about it. It's non-threatening. It's, something just, it's, I'm not going to say any other ways. It's just sort of almost looking away from her body. Whereas with Geraldine, it's a more interesting kind of depiction in that it watches far more. You might describe the narrative voice of the poem as being kind of far more voyeuristic. They are kind of watching this undressing of this kind of female figure. And they're actually drawing attention to certain bits of it. So she drops the cincture from beneath her breast is kind of the belt essentially underneath. She drops that off. She unrobes the silken robe, the inner vest. And it's far more kind of, it's a slower description. It takes in far more of it. And the narrative voice actually draws attention to the sexuality of Geraldine. So behold her bosom and half her side. Look at her, but then at the same time you get this kind of strange contradiction. The narrative voice also recognises that whilst this is beautiful, it's a kind of taboo area. It's something that you don't necessarily talk about. It's a sight to dream of, not to tell. This is not something that should be overtly talked about. It's something that Christabel needs kind of shielding from. You then get this bit down here, or sort of this bit I'm kind of focusing on now. And it's that kind of idea that with Geraldine, there is a kind of a power to her, but it's a kind of reluctant power and reluctant corruption of Christabel. There's a stricken look that was hers. So if you're stricken, you can be kind of stricken by an illness. You can be kind of stricken with remorse and regret. It's the idea of being kind of almost consumed with those kind of feelings. So she's stricken here. There's the implication that she kind of hesitates. And she has kind of deep from within to kind of lift this kind of sick weight as she kind of builds up to this. But out of a kind of, we don't know exactly what motivates her. She seeks delay, but ultimately she kind of collects herself in scorn and pride. So she's, again, if we treat this as an allegory, and we treat Geraldine as kind of a scorned and abandoned woman, frustrated at the kind of the way in which society has kind of discarded her, that's kind of represented here. She took Christabel, she collects herself in scorn and pride. There's a kind of, discarding of those judgments that surround her. And ultimately she entraps Christabel in the kind of, again, supernatural way, if you read the story more literally, but if you read the story more allegorically, then it's a more kind of sexual entrapping. The touch of this bosom, their work of the spell, which is lordly utterance. So Christabel has her agency taken away. It's associated with kind of something sexual as it kind of happens. And you get this kind of shared shame that goes with it. So you'll know it tonight, you'll know it tomorrow. Christabel is permanently shamed. There's the mark of my shame, the seal of my sorrow, where it's the implication here is that Geraldine is sharing her same shame. So she is corrupting Christabel, and if we go back to earlier on in the poem, the implication becomes she is corrupting her in the same way that she herself was corrupted by those men who kind of seized her and then abandoned her. So you're kind of dealing in and around that. And there's a sense that Christabel herself is kind of changed and transformed by this. O sorrow and shame, can this be she, the lady who knelt at the old oak tree? The narrative voice here is kind of shocked, essentially. There's a sense that they look on Christabel and they can't square the idea that both of these figures are the same figure. And whilst kind of Geraldine is able to kind of carry on, she's like a mother with her child, there's something kind of contented in the image. Christabel has been changed. There's something that's kind of been broken within her. And we get this as it kind of goes through. Tears she sheds, large tears that leave her lashes bright. But there is a kind of ambiguity. When we did this in class, we talked about the kind of liminal state, this kind of between two states. And if we think back to Christabel at the start, she's seeking out her own betrothed knight. At the close of the poem, she smiles as she weeps. So there's a sense that this new knowledge, or whatever it is that Geraldine has kind of imparted to her, is both something that she enjoys, that she takes pleasure in, but also something that she does see as kind of damaging. So within this, you get that kind of idea here of something, again, if we treat it as allegorical, if we treat this as kind of a sexual corruption, then obviously you're thinking about sex, so it's associated with kind of pleasure, with a kind of, carnal knowledge. but at the same time she's kind of weeping for that kind of stigmatization that society might apply even to a kind of fallen woman type image here. So just again, a couple of different bits that you might kind of pick out. For the first one, it's kind of the undressing of Geraldine. So you might do something with that. And I would say the bit with Helmer here, he's talking through one of his kind of fantasies. So I'll just give you a second to pause to find those bits in your own books and, to see if you can make anything with it. But basically, it's all about that kind of Madonna whore type complex, I would say here in terms of comparison. You've got a narrative voice in this one, as we spoke about before, who both draws attention to Geraldine, but also recognises this is sinful. It's pure, it's sort of desired even, but impure. You can't necessarily square these ideas. You want the whore, but you don't want the whore. You recognise that it's sort of impure. And then you've got Helmer, who's describing his fantasies to Nora. And the first of his fantasies is that she is a young bride, that this kind of the first time into our home, that she's a shy little darling. And there's this kind of image of purity that he idealises. But then he also is aroused by the kind of seductive figures of the tarantella. My blood was on fire. So as he watches her kind of publicly dance in a sexually provocative type way, he's also aroused by that. The two images don't necessarily square one with the other. The shy bride and the performative female figure who will kind of publicly display her sexuality. So there's a strong parallel here in terms of kind of masculine desire being presented through the poems, the two texts even, one through the narrative voice, one through the figure of Helmer. I would also take this a far shorter kind of bit. So we've got the mark of my shame, the seal of my sorrow, the kind of promise of Geraldine, and then we've got kind of Krogstad, Mrs. Lynn, this bit of discourse. Could you really do it? Tell me, do you know all of my past life, Mrs. Lynn? Yes. And do you know what they think of me here? So again, just pause it, have a think about what kind of the implication becomes here, how it's kind of similar or different. Okay. So it's the sharing of this kind of shame, essentially. It's a different type of shame. In Geraldine, it's the sharing of kind of sexual shame is the general interpretation, as she kind of shares that with Christabel, that kind of corruptive aspect. Whereas with Krogstad and Mrs. Lind, he's kind of questioning, she's sort of said, we should get back together is the implication. But what you get on the kind of flip side here is, again, Mrs. Lynn, that acceptance of it, she understands the implications of what's happening. It's maybe slightly less associated with the naivety of Christabel. And it's the exception of a kind of social stigma rather than a sexual stigma. But she willingly accepts this rather than has it kind of forced upon her in the way that Geraldine kind of forced it upon Christabel. And then this bit here, so, and lo, the worker of these harms that holds the maiden in his arms seems slender, still and mild, as a mother with his child. And then I would have this with Torvald. Very soon you won't need me to assure you that I've forgiven you. You will yourself feel the certainty that I've done so. So again, just pause, have a think what you can kind of draw out between the two, potentially. And what I would argue with this then is that basically you've got quite a strong similarity in that both of these kind of antagonistic figures don't necessarily recognise the harm that they've done to the other one. So you get the kind of tranquility of the figure of Geraldine in the first. She kind of holds the maiden, she slumbers still and mild, she is like a mother with her child. Whereas Torvald is sort of, once he's forgiven Nora, he thinks everything is past. He doesn't see that this has been a kind of transformative moment for Nora where she's recognised his kind of inadequacy, essentially. So there we go. For that one, it's kind of, again, dealing with the responses to these kind of sinful acts, the way in which the antagonistic figures are kind of depicted as kind of oblivious on some levels to the harm that they've caused. Right, and what I'll leave you with, people, is just a question that you can kind of play around with that would kind of link back to some of the things we've talked about. I'm not going to go through all of this. It's just there for you to kind of use as part of your revision, to kind of take it further, to see what you would kind of pick out and plan. So literature centres on the conflicts between protagonist and antagonist, even when that antagonist is not concrete but abstract. So abstract being sort of, they're not necessarily a singular human form, they're kind of wider than that. And there are various ways in which the exam might ask a question about this. They could focus simply on the antagonist figure. Here I've chosen to focus on the dynamics between them. So the kind of the relationship between protagonist and antagonist. And I'll give you some very brief hints and tips, things that you might go back and look at. The antagonist is very often attractive in certain ways to the protagonist. So they desire aspects of the antagonist. So Torvald's protection, his kind of stability that he can offer, but he's antagonistic. The social privilege in society is attractive, but then it also suppresses. Geraldine is an attractive figure. You've also got the kind of harm that they do, the obliviousness to the harm, etc. There's various ways in which you can kind of deal in and around this, okay? But for the moment, people, that'll do. Let's see if I can manage to upload this effectively.